Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. My guest today is Tomáš Klvaňa, a political scientist, journalist, long-time university teacher, and someone who has spent his professional life moving between Czech and American academia, politics, media, and international affairs. In the early 2000s, he briefly served as spokesman and advisor to President Václav Klaus, an experience that gave him a rare inside view of how politics really works.
I stayed for something like half a year.
Yeah, and then I was just going to ask you how long you lasted.
Yeah,
and I don't mean that he's
about 6 months, and I decided to leave because I realized I just didn't want to work with him.
Later, he became the Czech government's envoy for the planned US missile defense radar, a project that triggered fierce public debate, Russian disinformation, and, with hindsight, revealed how unprepared the West was to take the Russian threat seriously. Today, Tomáš Klvaňa is the executive director of the Aspen Institute Central Europe, a think tank based in Prague, and one of the sharpest observers of how politics, media and society are changing in Czechia, in Europe and in the United States.
I think in terms of communication, we are in a transition period from one model to another. I don't want to imply that journalism will die. It will never die, obviously. But it's changing, and we will need to adjust.
Tomáš was so kind that while traveling from Bratislava to Prague, he stopped in my hometown in Žďár, and I invited him for a cup of tea in one of our cafes. So, in this episode of Czechast, we talk about power and responsibility, about missed opportunities and hard lessons, about the decline of traditional media, the rise of populism, and about what liberal democracy may be losing in the process. I'm Vít Pohanka, and this is Czechast.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Well, my most important professional identity probably is a teacher. I teach at New York University, Prague, which is a campus of New York University here in Central Europe. I've been teaching there since 2001. My first class was a couple of days before 9/11, which was something memorable, and you obviously never forget that because you had students from New York City coming to Prague, and at the time they were my new students at NYU, so it was a very, very interesting start. And I've been there ever since. You know, I lived abroad in the UK, Belgium, and Germany, but I always try to teach at least a few times per semester. I also, since the last summer, serve as executive director of Aspen Institute Central Europe, which is the sister organization here in Central Europe of Aspen, United States.
Is that a full-time job in Aspen?
Yes, that is a full-time job, although I also teach in addition to it, so I have lots of full-time jobs.
Now, if we have anything in common, that is the fact that we both kind of grew up and started studying even before 1989, but I would say we had the opportunity to, intellectually kind of grow after 1989 in the 1990s. How much do you think this kind of experience helped you or still helps you today understand the world as it is?
Well, looking back, it seems quite invaluable because I was 23 when the regime changed in 1989. I was at the School of Journalism of Charles University at the time. And so I do have meaningful recollections from the totalitarian communist regime. And that was a really interesting experience which shaped my thinking, and I think it still shapes my thinking until this day, that experience of communist totalitarianism. After that, I finished that school in 1992, because I was a student of journalism and then social sciences, I started working as a journalist for Radio Free Europe and Studentské listy. I also founded a revolutionary broadcasting in Czech radio in 1989 and 1990, which was called Studio G. Then I went to the United States. I got my PhD from the University of Minnesota in communications theory and political science. And I've been working as a journalist, and then I went to politics and then to business and consulting. So I have pretty diverse experience, pretty checkered past, you may say.
Why Minnesota?
Well, that's a wonder. Well, it's a great question. I really, really wanted to get to the United States. That was my dream when I was growing up in the communist Czechoslovakia. As you recall, this was like a cage, right? We were not really able to travel meaningfully abroad, especially to the free world. Most of us were not able to do that, and it was always my dream to get to the United States, so I really tried hard. I met a couple of people, Americans in Prague, because in the early 1990s, Prague was full of young Americans. There was this saying in 1990, 1991 that if you had a fresh MBA, you would be an advisor to the minister of the Czech government at the time. So Prague was swarming with Americans, and some of them were artists, some of them were intellectuals, some of them were business people. So I met a couple of them and befriended them. We tried to start an educational institute. So my first trip to the United States was in 1991. And it was to raise money for this educational exchange program. I got to Washington, D.C. and then to Minneapolis, because before I went to the United States, I met in Prague Professor Joe Mestenhauser, who was a Czech emigre, one of those young student activists from 1947, 1948. He was a democratic activist, anti-communist activist, active in one of the democratic parties at the time. So he was imprisoned in 1948. He was captured, tortured by the communists in 1948, but he managed to escape from the prison, and then he also emigrated at that same year to first Germany and then to the United States, and he became a big name in international education. So by the time I met him in early 1990s, he was an established professor of the University of Minnesota, and he tried to persuade me to get a PhD from an American university. And I didn't want that. I knew that I wanted to study in the United States, but PhD seemed pretty daunting. I wanted to get a master's degree. But he did persuade me, and he actually managed to get me a scholarship for the first year. So I started studying in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. That first year covered by a grant from NAFSA. It was actually a U.S. government grant at the time, and as of my second PhD year, I got a assistantship from the University of Minnesota. So I was also teaching there, teaching undergraduates, which was very, very adventurous with my limited English at the time. But it was a fantastic experience because I really learned a lot. I still pity my first students. I was teaching in 1994, so I actually teach at American universities almost without interruption since 1994. So Joe Mestenhauser was the guy who was mostly responsible for it. He also helped lots of other Czechs, not just in Minnesota, but in many other universities, and not only Czechs. He recently because he passed away a few years ago. And he had a commemorative event conference about him and his life at the American Center in Prague. And I thought, because I was asked to speak there at a panel, And I was thinking, okay, it's going to be a few people in the room, remembering Joe. And there were people coming from all over the world. There were people from India, from Indonesia, from Japan. That was quite interesting for me to see how many people he really helped. So if there is anyone from the United States who has not gotten a meaningful award from the Czech state, some sort of medal, I would plead for Joe Mestenhauser.
What was it like being in Minneapolis? My only recollection of being there is from 2008, because the Republican Party had the nomination. What is it called? It's not nomination Congress.
It's called convention.
Convention. Yeah.
Republican National Convention.
And John McCain was actually nominated as a candidate there. That was actually I think my first time in proper Midwest, that's why I'm kind of asking. And I spent some time around. And coming then from Washington, D.C., I was wondering, what it would be like to live in a Midwestern city. So I'm asking you now, what was it like?
Well, I love Minneapolis, the Twin Cities. I actually found it more interesting at the time when I came to the United States, contrasted it with Washington, D.C., because it was a proper American city, right? It had these skyscrapers in downtown and the sprawling neighborhoods around the metro area. Washington is a different type of town. I loved it. It was very international. Mm-hmm. Not too many people really know. It has lots of really good universities. Minnesota is a state populated mostly by Scandinavian Americans and German Americans. Very, very, very rich. One of the richest states in the United States, measured by GDP per capita, but also measured by American standards. Very socially conscious. It has a relatively, obviously you have to take that with you have to think about it in the American frames of reference, but it has some safety net, social safety net. It has very, very good public healthcare system, and they were always trying to tell me when I came to to Minneapolis that Minnesota is kind of a middle of the road state, that Republicans and Democrats are always kind of pragmatic and non-ideological. And then I looked at the Congress, and they had in Congress at the time the most leftist senator by the name of Paul Wellstone, who was almost like a Marxist, right? And in order to compensate for that, at the next election in 1994, they elected a gentleman by the name of Rod Grams, who was the most right-wing ideological Republican. And a couple of years after that, possibly to balance that out, they elected Jesse Ventura.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jesse the Body Ventura.
Yeah.
The former professional wrestler.
He was a governor, wasn't he?
He was a governor for some time. Yeah. He was only governor.
He was only governor.
Yeah, governor. So I was kind of thinking that maybe Minnesota is changing politically, and indeed it was, because today it is also divided, much like the rest of the United States. There's a strong electorate of Donald Trump, especially in the countryside, in the woods, right? But of course, most areas in the Twin Cities are blue politically.
Nearly, even liberals. Okay, but back to your career. You touched on that. You just mentioned that you spent some time in the UK, Germany, Belgium, right? Just briefly, what did you do there?
I was working for a company for BAT, British.
So for business, basically.
Yeah, it was business. Yeah, and I kept my teaching, so I was coming back to Prague a couple of times per semester teaching and at NYU.
I was just going to ask you, what kept you coming back, Was it just the teaching, or is it the roots? Do you know?
Well, that's an interesting question. In 1998, I was teaching at the University of Maine, because after my PhD studies, I got my PhD in 1997, and I got a tenure track job at the University of Maine system in Portland at the USM. And so I was teaching there, and at the end of that period, which was in 2000, so at the time I was in the United States for 7 years consecutively, my first daughter was born in 1998 in Maine. I was married, so
But your wife is Czech.
My wife is Slovak, but she has Czech citizenship. So we were living in Portland, Maine, which is a beautiful Atlantic town, not far away from Boston, in a beautiful area. And the university I was teaching at offered me, because my visa expired, my postdoc visa expired, and they offered me a lawyer to kind of like smooth the transition to a real working visa. And I really loved the United States at the time. In 1999, 2000, I was really feeling that I already understand the United States. Or the first few years, I didn't like the United States. It was really difficult to get used to this kind of really new life. But eventually, I got to understand it, and I felt comfortable in the United States. And I realized that if I then decided to stay in May in 1999, in 2000, I would probably never return back to Czech Republic. So we made this cut. We decided to come back to Prague, which was like returning to a very different world, because the 90s were a decisive period of change for the Czech Republic. Everything changed. So we were in fact returning to a different country, if I may say. It's my home, right? So I lived, like about half of my professional life, I lived abroad. But I always came back for some reason. Maybe it's a sense of obligation to do something in the country where you were born at. My kids love Prague. One of my daughters lives in Prague. The one that was born in the United States. The other one lives in London. But they always love being in Prague, and so this is definitely our home. And I also think that in the meantime, in the last 35 years, Prague has become one of the most interesting and livable cities that I have ever lived.
This is definitely right. And let me just mention, until recently, I spent more time abroad between the 90s and now than back home. But somehow I still felt always that my home is here, I mean, I never felt tempted, so I suppose we call it similar. If I fast forward a little bit, I think beginning 2003, you spent some time working as a spokesperson for then new president, Václav Klaus, who is, how shall I put it, who is known for being a very kind of strong personality. What was it like?
You may say he's outspoken. Well, it was an interesting decision. I was not a Klaus fan at the time. We were very much, I mentioned I was with Studentské listy, the student newspaper in 1990, which is kind of a misleading for our international audiences, because it was a national newspaper run by students, right? By us, by the revolutionary generation. And at that time, Klaus was one of the decisive politicians in Czech politics. And we were supporting his policies at that time.
But for fast economic transformation.
Exactly. He was very much trying to establish democracy, liberal democracy, without any epithets, So he was trying to get away from these illusions that you can do something in between socialism and capitalism. And he also was very much the political engine of privatization and establishment of liberal economics in the Czech Republic. So we were really supporting him. By the early 2000s, he was much more controversial political personality, and I was definitely not his supporter anymore. I wrote a couple of really controversial articles, like critical articles about him. So when I became his spokesperson, obviously the media dug up all those critical articles and they republished it, right? And I thought that Klaus knew that, right? That he was trying to make this gesture that he wants to be inclusive, but he didn't. He was kind of reading that and said, "Tomáši, what did you write about me?" So yeah, I became a spokesperson and advisor to the president it was just after he was elected, late February. and I stayed for something like half a year.
Yeah, and then I was just going to ask you how long you lasted, and I just mean that he's
about 6 months, and I decided to leave because I realized I just didn't want to work with him. He essentially holds the same views as he at the time. He held the same views as he's holding today about European Union and transatlantic politics and Russia. He was just not vocal about them. He was vocal. He was kind of venting those behind closed doors, but he was not. He was not open about his views. So I was really horrified. Who he actually was, right?
Who he became, I think, more or less.
He was always the same. He just was not brave enough to say that out aloud to me. 2003, yes.
The reason why I thought that he must have changed a little bit, at least, is I actually interviewed him for the BBC in 1999, I think, in London. Once he was invited by Chatham House for a talk, and at that time he was the Speaker of the House, I think. And we were talking about European Union, and he said at that time, at least that's what he was saying, European Union membership definitely, but not Euro. That was his position. But and then I remember, that after our entry to the European Union, he was turning more. It seemed to me that he was changing a little bit. But you say he's been always like that today.
Yeah, he was very much against the European Union in 2003, even though he was the president of the country. He was just acceding to the European Union. 2003, people forgot about that, but 2003 was the year of the referendum. Czechs voted yes, pretty overwhelmingly.
And he, as a president, didn't support. He didn't want to say that.
Yeah, he voted no. He voted. A journalist came to me and asked me how the president voted in the referendum. I didn't know. I had my hunch from the talk in the inner circle. Indeed, my sense was that I was probably the only one in the inner circle of the president who voted yes. But he told me, okay. I asked him, Mr. President, how did you vote? Because journalists are asking me. I said, Tomáš, this is a secret vote, and this is a secret vote. We cannot vote. I'm talking about, you are president. You should publish. No, it's secret. He refused to say. And only a few years after that, in some article for a journal, for a political science journal somewhere, I forgot which it was, in the asterisks, he actually admitted that he voted against.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he did. He did admit that. So he still, he may have been telling you as a BBC journalist in 1999 something because obviously he was probably not brave enough to reveal his real views at that time yet, but gradually he became pretty brazen, and by 2009, 2010 he was fairly openly Eurosceptical, and recently he even moved to the anti-EU camp, and he really wants the Czech Republic to leave the European Union, which is amazing.
Which is quite radical, yeah, let me put it that way. But you look back at those, at that time.
It was great. It was a very, very good experience.
I was just going to ask you, how did it help you?
Well,
what did you learn?
Well, I learned how politics works from within, which is quite different from just looking at it from the journalist perspective or from the outsider perspective. You can actually see how those political decisions are made. You learn that politicians are the same people as everyone else with their strengths and weaknesses, right? That many times looks like very thought through process, and that politicians are trying to make these smart moves that they're thinking two, three steps ahead. Most of the time, this is not the case. It's just like very chaotic process. Sometimes very, very ordinary elements come into the into the decision-making process that influence it. People's weaknesses, animosities, etc. Well, the social media actually helped us quite a bit to reveal that part of politics, which was hidden before. But also it was on the ordinary, ordinary human level, an extremely interesting work, because I was part of the delegation to Palais d'Élysée. We had a lunch with President Chirac. I was at the talks with then German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. I met all kinds of interesting people. I had a very, very intimate dinner with President Klaus and Henry Kissinger. So it was a great experience. It was just a fantastic experience. So I'm thankful to President Klaus that he chose me. Like, I just didn't want to. I didn't want to continue because I had very different views from him, and obviously he was the boss, right? So it was not, my job to try to change him. So I had to either adjust, which is something I did not want to do. So the fair decision was to leave, and I did that.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and my guest today is Tomáš Klvaňa, Executive Director of Aspen Institute Central Europe, part of the international think tank based in Prague.
So you returned to teaching or to journalism?
Mozamo. Teaching journalism. I was working for that company for a brief period of time. I was also often...
And is that like advising on communication?
Mostly working on these issues like communication and public affairs, and things like strategic positioning, things like that. I was then working on behalf of the Czech government when Czech government wanted to accede to the missile defense program.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
It was 2000, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2007 and 2008.
I remember that because I was in Brussels, and as a Brussels correspondent, you are also accredited to NATO. And of course, the missile defense, just to explain to the listeners. Or can you explain that to the listeners?
It was called the third pillar of missile defense that the United States wanted to create in Europe, together with the Czech and Polish governments, because Europe is still, and at the time even more, was vulnerable to ballistic missile attacks, possible ballistic missile attacks from rogue countries or possibly terrorist groups, right? So it was aimed at the time at unstable areas in the neighborhood, like the Middle East, for example. Right? The fear was that at one point maybe Iran could possess few ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, and it would threaten Europe, and Europe had no defense. Or maybe some rogue terrorist organization might get a handle of those weapons and shoot them in the direction of Europe. So it was always meant to be a defense against attacks with up to 5, 6, 10 isolated missiles. It was never meant to defend us against Russians with their hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles not far away from Europe. The Czech Republic was supposed to be the host of the tracking radar, and Poland was supposed to host 11 kinetic anti-missiles, right? So I was in charge of the communication on behalf of the Czech government.
Well, as an envoy, I think.
Yeah.
Could you call that?
I was like an envoy for missile defense. I was explaining to Czechs why the Czech Republic wants to do that. Right. My task was not really to persuade them, although obviously we would have loved to persuade Czechs, because it was Czechs overwhelmingly were against this. It was like I forgot that exact number, but something like 70% of the population just did not want to have this American station
installation. Either though it was just a radar. They didn't want to have anything to do with the U.S. military.
Yeah. So I was traveling throughout the Czech Republic, holding town hall meetings with people all over the place, in big cities, small towns, villages, trying to persuade them, or more like explain to them, because it was the first time we actually encountered the sophisticated Russian propaganda about this, right? It was 2007, was the year when the Russian propaganda left the region of the post-Soviet Union, because they obviously used their hybrid warfare in Ukraine and in the Baltics and in other countries. But in 2007, for the first time, they actually used it in Central Europe because they did not want American installation in the Czech Republic. So they're spreading all kinds of nonsense about this radar. Like it was, for example, the microwaves from the radar would kill everyone in the vicinity of the radar. All this nonsense, right? So we brought experts to those villages who were explaining how microwaves work, and we brought generals who were explaining what the radar is for. Most of that was not successful because people stayed against that. But the program ended unsuccessfully, not because of that, but it ended because President Obama, who was elected in 2008 and started functioning in the White House in January 2009, stopped this program as part of his reset with Russia. He wanted to have good relations, kind of naively. He believed that if he makes this friendly gesture towards Moscow would reciprocate and they would have friendly relations. So he stopped it, right? He reconfigured the missile defense program. Part of my job was also to travel to the United States. So I was working with the White House, the Bush White House, and especially National Security Council. But also I was working on the Hill with relevant committees in Congress. And I realized at the time that the program is controversial, even in the United States. So the Bush government pushed it, but it did not have support from the oppositional Democrats.
I remember Dianne Feinstein, I think, was quite against it.
Well, Ellen Tauscher was against that in Congress, but many other Democrats were kind of like against the program. And so I was thinking, oh my God, we're trying to establish something that is very unstable, right? Mm. We are spending political capital of the government at the time on something that might end if we get a new government in Washington. And this is exactly what happened.
This is exactly what happened. And in the end, I think the kind of sense I got from some diplomats that before this fight to have this American radar in Czechia, the government, meaning, the official representation, then it was betrayed basically from the American side. And other countries such as Romania and Bulgaria kind of benefited, from the cooperation with the US anyway.
Because they got some sort of reconfigured missile defense, although not as effective as it would have been if it were in Central Europe, right? It was important for us because we realized that Americans do not take the Russian threat seriously at the time, right? We were coming to Washington, and our official line for why we wanted to do radar was the official explanation that the radar would be against the missiles from the Middle East, right? And that was true, obviously. But for the government of Mirek Topolánek at the time I was representing, the more important reason of having this installation was to have an American base in Czech Republic. Because when you have an American base on your territory, you are automatically protected on a higher level
than if you do
not, right? And that's what we wanted, right? It would be like confirmation of belonging to this Western alliance. And Russians knew that. And I talked to lots of people in the Czech Republic, and they didn't understand that. It was really difficult to explain that. The best explanation I actually heard from anyone on this was my friend and singer David Koller, who was a big supporter of this, and he helped us quite a bit in the campaign. And he said, "Listen, I want an American radar here, because if it's not an American radar, we might eventually get Russian or Chinese."
I sometimes wonder why. And it's probably there's nothing rational behind it. But when Czechia entered NATO in 1999, all the polls said, majority of people were for it.
Yes.
On the one hand, and then you fast forward a few years, and then it comes to a radar, and that's all. And this big majority against it, you know?
Well, it's, I think, partly because NATO membership is abstract, right? It's but then you when become a member, it's no longer they NATO, it's us, and it requires commitments and sometimes even sacrifices, right? In order to have this collective, not just missile defense, but collective defense, you just have to make commitments. You have to pay for your defense. You have to be able to make sacrifices, and Czechs were not used to that, right? Also, the Bush government was very unpopular in Central Europe, especially in the Czech Republic. In Poland, it was still quite popular because Polish are naturally more pro-American than Czechs. The government was not as unpopular, obviously, as in Germany or France, but Czechs were not very supportive of the Bush government, and so there was this fear in which all kinds of communist and nationalist and populist parties actually exploited, with the help of the Russian propaganda, the fact that we would have radar here would actually draw us into some military conflict. So it was a big debate, and for us, the obvious experience and lesson was this was a lost opportunity, and also clear signal that Russians have not given up on Central Europe, that they want to be factor here, they want to influence Central Europe, and that's what we see 2 decades fast forward. You know, they still have designs on Central Europe, and one of the Putin's demands is to actually go to 1997, right, to the situation before the expansion of NATO, which is absolutely unacceptable for us. But there are political parties in the Czech Republic now that support it.
Before we get to that, let me just ask you, when I was reading through some of the interviews that you did, I think you've been quite critical of the decline of Czech media quality. Is that fair, to say that? And if you were to describe it again to the listeners, what do you see as wrong? What's wrong with the Czech media?
Well, I would have to exempt the public media because
Oh, thank you.
The Czech public media, meaning Czech radio and Czech television, are still very high quality, especially compared to the media in the neighboring countries like Poland, Slovakia, or Hungary, where those public media are very much under the control of governments.
Oh, right. Fully, I would say even, yeah.
Czech public media are still very, very independent, which is almost like a miracle. We'll see how long that will last.
We will see.
So in that regard, I think Czech television and Czech radio especially keep very, very high quality in journalism, especially. But the rest of the media scene, unfortunately, suffers from the same fate as any kind of media anywhere else. Chiefly the breakdown of the old journalism model. You used to have, up until early 2000s, most media were supported by advertising and obviously circulation, right? Like sold copies. Because of many reasons, I don't want to go into details, but because of many reasons, this has collapsed, right? Advertising has left almost entirely. And circulation has dropped significantly. Let me just give you an example. And it's not just in Czech Republic, it's everywhere, right? So many American news have gone belly up, right? I remember in the 1990s reading and at one point also working in the summer for Minneapolis Star-Tribune, which was one of the major newspapers in the United States. Always been very high quality. When I was working there, and it was just a summer job, right? I was not working as a journalist. It was just like a summer job because I was not covered by any other income. So I was there. But I remember, for example, especially the Sunday edition of the New York of Minneapolis Star-Tribune was like this thick. Right, and you remember that maybe from the United States, right? That the newspapers were like one edition of a newspaper was almost like a bundle, right? With all kinds of advertising, all kinds of supplements, this and that, When you look at any newspaper today, it's a very thin layer of, paper because advertising has disappeared, right? So it has happened everywhere. But when you have a small and relatively poor market, like Czech market, like you only have 10 million Czechs in the Czech Republic and not much of a diaspora anywhere else, this means that the readership of the people who are able to read Czech is limited. Right? It's not like the English-speaking world with hundreds of millions of people, billions of people. German-speaking world with more than 100 million people.
I can also say even the Polish. I mean, when I spent my time in Poland, the Polish market is 4 times bigger. Yeah, 40.
This is really a small market, which means that it was hit even harder than elsewhere. So let me just give you an example. I was in 2000 and 2001, I was working for Hospodářské noviny, which is an economic newspaper, at the time owned by the Dow Jones and Handelsblatt, like a consortium of American and German owners. And I was deputy editor of that newspaper. And one of my responsibilities was foreign department, foreign coverage. So in that department, we had 20 people, which is obviously measured by large country standards, not big, right? But for Czech, the newspapers, it was quite sizable to have 20 full-time journalists working for the foreign desk. We had two international correspondents based in Brussels and in Bratislava. We had budget for travel, so I would go and try and cover American elections. Right, I would go to Brussels. I would go elsewhere. Today, that department has 2 people. Last time I checked, just a couple of years ago, maybe not even that anymore. And they have almost no money for travel, which is just a sign of how poor the newspapers have become. And as a result of that, obviously, the quality has dropped, right? Quite a bit. So that's unfortunately true of many small markets. In addition to that, we are seeing this rise of entertainment by way of social media. So the pressure on journalistic standards is increasing, right? Meaning the standards go down. Because it's opinion that sells. That matters, yeah. That matters now. So papers and media organizations have become more opinionated. Even serious newspapers, even a serious media, serious television programs are using a different kind of language from the one we used 20 years ago. So that's all contributed to this change in the way we communicate, and it produced a different kind of politics. Based on confrontation, emotions, especially negative emotions. That's why you have the rise of populism, not just because of this, but this is a significant factor.
You know, it was interesting when I recently interviewed Kateřina Šafaříková, who now works for Seznam Zprávy, and she has a long experience from Brussels. And she returned to Brussels after a period of time when she wasn't there in 2021, after COVID, actually. And she said that even in Brussels, everything changed, not because of COVID, but because of social media, because we used to have press conferences in Brussels in 2007, 2008 still, after the official meeting of the European Commission every Wednesday. Yeah. So that was the source of information. And you had the time and you had the possibility to mingle with some of the people from the Commission to get some background information and like that. And now she says, the commissioners, they tweet something, and that's it. There's the press conference is basically redundant.
But they complicated their work, right? Because they can now go over the head of the media and speak to voters directly, right, through social media, which, however, also means that they're not challenged. Another example, when you look at the White House press pool today, it's full of influencers. Yeah, right? It's obviously you still have serious people, serious correspondents there, but they are receding in importance, and politicians prefer these influencers. Right? I was at the DNC last year in Chicago. No, it was not last year. It was 2024, Democratic National Convention. Right? Most press people there were these influencers, and they were preferred. So I had people from CNN. I was there on behalf of CNN Czech Republic. So I was commenting on it for CNN Prima News. But many people were complaining that, many serious newspapers were complaining that they did not get preferential treatment anymore. Instead, these influencers are there. The politicians are speaking to these influencers because they know very well that these influencers have a large megaphone. They have lots of people who follow them, and they will never challenge them. Right? They will never ask tough questions, right? It's kind of access, right? They want access. So they will be nice to politicians. So that completely changes the way politics is communicated these days.
Well, I'm afraid I don't want to compare it with your experience. My experience when it comes to influences is that past year I was actually asked by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to kind of moderate an event, to present it, to speak there, etc. And it was meant for public. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was trying to show what kind of development programs they have. It was meant to be for schools, so I was to moderate. Mm-hmm. But there were just very, very few people. But there were influencers.
Yeah.
Because they used to...
So they do selfies, they do videos.
Yeah, they do videos there and everything, and they were very kind of active. And as much as I was kind of honored, to be invited by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I was telling the responsible, quite high position and say, hey, look, do you really need me for this? I mean, what am I doing here, Mm-hmm. Because what matters is really those influences. So I'm afraid that this kind of thinking, goes deeper. It's not just the politician, but it's important to have in someone show you on the internet, yeah.
I think in terms of communication, we are in a transition period from one model to another. I don't want to imply that journalism will die. It will never die, obviously, but it's changing, and we will need to adjust, right? There will be influencers, there will be serious media, there will be traditional media. Side by side, and we will eventually arrive at an equilibrium. As you like with the rise of TV, radio didn't die; it's just changed, right? With the rise of streaming, television didn't die, but it changed, right? So it's going to change. The communication is going to be changing, and we are still in that transition period. And we will eventually settle this and arrive at a new equilibrium. The question, however, is that during the transition period, there are always things that are lost. And I'm really afraid that we will lose something significant from something really relevant for liberal democracy when we eventually get there. And you can see it in the rise of populist politics and post-liberal politics, everywhere. So this is a decisive time for democracy.
Maybe you just hinted that, but let me ask you, as the executive director of Aspen Institute, Central Europe, what kind of, when we look at the politics, media, society in general, what worries you most, and where, on the other hand, do you perhaps see something positive, some strength?
Well, the positive thing certainly is that many more people are now involved in politics than before. So I remember the time from 20 years ago when lots of people were alienated from politics because they kind of felt that they don't matter, right? They don't have any voice. They're not really represented. But the left-wing mainstream parties and right-wing parties are kind of very similar to each other. So people don't really have a choice. Well, that is gone, right? People are involved. Lots of people are involved. These populists like Trump, but also other, they have drawn many new people, many new voters, many new activists into politics. Politics has become much more confrontational. You have many new ideas in politics. Universities, so like when I was teaching at a university in the 90s, and there was this very, very stifling consensus in American universities and colleges. Most people were on the left, right? If you were conservative, you were really suspect. That is changing today. You have a very vibrant conservative movement with lots of interesting ideas. But it also means, and this is especially true of the United States, because the United States has also always been very much open to new ideas, much more so than Europe, that there's this danger that really bad ideas will become established in politics. And Trump is one of the expressions of this, right? Like Trump has become president in 2017, then again in 2025. So we cannot treat him as a fluke anymore. He represents something really serious in American and world politics. And most of that, in my opinion, is very dangerous. So it's a time of opportunity. It's a time of intellectual combat. You have really new, interesting ideas coming to the fore and dueling it out, with other ideas. But lots of these ideas, especially from the populist right, and to a lesser extent from the populist left, are dangerous for liberal democracy. So we cannot take anything for granted. So if we are like in that Chinese proverb, we actually do live in interesting times. But we shouldn't forget that the ancient Chinese meant it as a curse. Like, may you live in interesting times is kind of meant ironically.
Well, Tomáš Klvaňa, thank you very much for your time and for stopping by in Žďár nad Sázavou in this cafe. Good luck, and I hope to see you again soon, perhaps.
My pleasure, anytime.
And that's all for this episode of Czechast. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Tomáš Klvaňa as much as I. And if you did, please consider following the podcast, leaving a rating or sharing the episode with someone who might be interested. It really helps Czechast find new listeners. Many thanks again to my guest, Tomáš Klvaňa. I'm Vít Pohanka. Stay safe, stay curious, stay healthy, and until next time, as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.